Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us here tonight. Sorry, we're getting a little bit of a late start. We were having some technical difficulties on our end. My name is Tim Horgan. I am the Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. I'm going to keep our introduction pretty short tonight, but I do want to thank everyone who's watching us here live, as well as for those people who will be watching the recording. The World Affairs Council of New Hampshire is a nonprofit, nonpartisan membership organization, and your support is vital to allowing us to continue to run programs such as this. We hope that you will consider becoming a member of our organization or donating to help us continue these programs. I want to quickly bring on Bob Blair, one of our board members, to talk a little bit about his experiences with the council and why he is a member.
Well, my interest in the world started when I was pretty young, really. I can remember refusing an athletic scholarship so I could go to a school that had a program in Europe. And I did go there, studied at the University of Fribourg in Switzerland, and did extensive traveling in Europe. When I graduated, though, I started a family, started a business, and my world travels kind of came to a halt, but not my interest in the world. The kids grew up and I retired. And about that time, I joined the World Affairs Council. One of the first things I did actually when I retired was to reacquaint myself with the world. I went on a round the world trip with One World, which is an airline ticket. And I promptly won, kind of rabbit out of the hat kind of thing, a contest where I got 7 trips for the next 7 years. The first trip was a bike trip in Croatia. I had to look at a map to make sure I was heading for the right place. And but then the pandemic hit, and so I'm still waiting for to kick off the second one of those trips. I think what the World Affairs Council offers me is a way to stay in touch with the world, even though I'm not doing traveling to these countries, traveling to see what's going on culturally, politically, with the various countries and the various regions, really, of the world. I think we've had some fascinating speakers. And one of the things I really like about the World Affairs Council is they sponsor international leaders to come to the States. And as a benefit to those people, they spend an evening with a U.S. family. And I was one of those families. And as it so happened, it was Thanksgiving. And we had a group from Kazakhstan come over, and they made the connection with Americans' love of turkey and their love of camel. So I just took that connection as an act of faith on my part. I didn't really quiz any further, but it was a very pleasant evening with a great group of men and women. I think we had 6 in all that night. But I don't know where else, what other organization you're going to find a combination of the intellectual stimulus that the seminars, conferences hold, as well as the personal touch that you get by having people from faraway places in your home sitting around having dinner.
Thanks, Bob. We really appreciate your support and your leadership of the council. I wanted to quickly go over the way in which we will be taking questions after Bonnie's presentation tonight. You can join us on our social media pages and send us your questions there. You can email us at council@wacnh.org, or on the Facebook Messenger app we have on our website homepage. We'll be taking questions throughout the evening, so please do send them in early and often. We hope to get through as many of them as possible. Before I introduce our speaker tonight, I would also like to mention that the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire is a nonpartisan organization, and therefore the ideas, thoughts, and opinions expressed here tonight are those of the speaker and do not necessarily represent the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire, its board, staff, members, donors, or supporters. We are here as a platform for discussion and for intellectual rigor. We hope that you take the opportunity to listen here tonight and formulate your own opinions. Having said that, I know you're not here to listen to me, but rather to Bonnie, so I will invite Bonnie up to the screen. Bonnie is a senior advisor for Asia and the director of the China Power Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where she works on related issues to the Asia-Pacific security with a focus on Chinese foreign policy and security. She is also a non-resident fellow with the Lowry Institute in Sydney, Australia, and a senior associate with the Pacific Forum. She has worked for more than 3 decades at the intersection of Asia-Pacific geopolitics and U.S. policy, which makes her a perfect speaker for tonight's program on the future of the U.S. and Chinese geopolitical strategic competition. I turn it over to Bonnie now, and we'll be back for a quick Q&A later.
Well, thank you so much for having me as a speaker at the World Affairs Council for New Hampshire. I'm going to talk about the U.S.-China relationship, and many of you may know that just a few days ago, senior officials from the United States and China met for the first time in the Biden administration, which is still, I think, under 70 days old, relatively new. The first time that we've had senior officials from both of our countries get together for a serious round of discussions. This was at the level of our National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, and the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, meeting with the person who is in charge of foreign policy, a Politburo member named Yang Jiechi, and the foreign minister, Wang Yi. And they met in Anchorage, Alaska. They had about 9 hours, I believe, of meetings, 3 different sessions. If you read anything about it in the media, it was very testy, but it was also constructive. The U.S.-China relationship is in many ways the most consequential of our time. China is becoming a stronger country in many ways, and it has many things that I think it would like to change about the international system, which it views as unfavorable to Chinese interests. And it also wants to return China to what it sees as its rightful place in the world. But tonight I'm going to talk less about China's perspective on the relationship and more about the U.S. perspective, U.S. policy, U.S. interests. And we can get into whatever issues you would like during the Q&A. I'll start just by giving a just very short sort of thumbnail sketch of some history as to how we got here. And only hitting on a few of the high points. In the early 70s, when Richard Nixon was president, and he and Henry Kissinger were the architects of the opening to China. 1969, there had been skirmishes on the border of China and the former Soviet Union. And China was in a difficult position and was interested in having an opening to the United States and as a counterweight to the Soviet Union. And at that time, we had no trade with China to speak of and virtually no people-to-people exchanges. We knew very little about China. China was enmeshed and internally focused in the Cultural Revolution, which lasted from 1966 to 1976. And so the early 70s, the Cultural Revolution was still raging. U.S. pursued what came to be known as a policy of engagement, which was, I think, intended to encourage China to endorse market forces, to implement democratic reforms, and to strengthen the existing international order and the Asian order. And if we fast forward to 1989 and the tragedy of Tiananmen Square, where students and others were killed after there were protests and the Chinese government decided to crack down, that episode dashed the hopes, I think, of those in the United States who thought that China could be shaped in America's image. And by the mid to late 2000s, I think it became clear that China was heading down a very different path in its foreign policy as well. And rather than become the international stakeholder, which is what the U.S. said it hoped for in the George W. Bush administration, China began to behave more assertively, promoting its interests in ways that pose challenges to and threats to American interests. So this trend accelerated under the current leader of China, Xi Jinping. He came to power in November of 2012. He has reversed economic reforms. He has implemented autocratic policies domestically. He has promoted changes in the regional and international orders. And he's pursued policies that are aimed at eroding America's power and position in the world. So I have some slides tonight where I'm going to show you some of the policies that Xi Jinping is pursuing and talk about some of the problems in the bilateral relationship. And I'll try to go through this pretty quickly so that we can have a good discussion afterwards. There will be certainly things that I will leave out, but I'm going to try to hit on the things that I think are really important. So if we'll go to the first slide, skip that one. We'll start with Xi Jinping's national objectives. And Xi Jinping at the 19th Party Congress that took place in 2019, and he laid out objectives that China is seeking to achieve. These are targets. Some of them are very vague, but prior leaders really have not set out targets in quite this way. 2049 will be the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. And so the goal that Xi Jinping articulated when he first came to power was the China dream. He wasn't the first Chinese leader to say that China should achieve national rejuvenation, but he was and is the first leader to actually put a deadline on that. And that is included in the goals that you see for 2049, to make China into a socialist, modern, and powerful country. At that time, China, he said, will also have significant international influence, somewhat vague, and establish a first-tier military, which sounds like a military that is equal to perhaps that of the United States. And then he set interim goals at the halfway point, basically, and that's 2035. And he said China should realize socialist modernization, become a global leader in innovation, boost its soft power, and complete PLA modernization. In and of itself, these things are not necessarily threatening to the United States. It's the way that they're achieved. And I'm going to talk about that in some greater detail. I will start with the issue of becoming a global leader in innovation, because technology is at the center of U.S.-China competition today. And in 2017, which was the year that President Trump came to power, there was a national security strategy that was released at the end of that year. And it was the first time that the U.S.-China relationship was framed as a strategic competition, that China was named a rival and a revisionist power. And during the Trump administration, the assessment of the threats that are posed by China were said more clearly than ever before, even though some of the assessments were made internally even before the Trump administration came to power. And the Biden administration shares much of the assessments that the Trump administration made. And at the end of my talk, after I do talk about the components of the U.S.-China competition and the drivers, I'll talk a little bit about what the Biden administration is doing that's similar to its predecessor, and then about what it's doing differently. So next slide, please. I'm going to start, as I said, by talking about innovation and high technology. China does have the goal of dominating the 21st century strategic technologies, the areas of technology that will make its country great. And in the past, China has had a track record of stealing a lot of intellectual property. High technology, the F-35 being one example, but there are many. Some of it is military technology, some of it is commercial technology. The Assistant Attorney General for National Security under the Trump administration publicly described a Chinese policy of rob, replicate, and replace. So basically steal it, copy it, and then replace that company, and then ultimately the entire sector. Replace it in the Chinese market and then eventually in the global market. We've actually seen that happen. Solar panels would be one example where China did steal technology and then ultimately put companies out of business, and today is dominant in that market. In some areas it may not matter, but there are national security areas that do matter. 5G networks, for example, and Huawei is very dominant globally. But the United States and Australia and Japan and some other countries have banned Huawei from their 5G networks. And what you see here is a picture of the Made in China 2025 program. It's an industrial policy that China rolled out. China's many industrial policies. It sets targets and has 5-year plans. So these are the areas where China has said that it wants to dominate. And of course, semiconductors, things like that, where China lags behind so far, but would like to dominate, that do pose, I think, threats to the ability of the United States to remain competitive. And also European countries like Germany are also quite concerned about this. China has a civil military fusion program. Another industrial policy, essentially, where China is trying to smoothly transfer from its civilian sector to its military capabilities. And this has, I think, made the United States quite concerned about future developments of military capabilities. And I'll talk more about that later. So go to the next slide. And here's the military issue. I always love maps. What you see is a picture of what's referred to as the first and second island chains. The first island chain goes from Japan through Taiwan, the Philippines, down further to Malaysia. And all of those waters inside the first island chain, China essentially thinks is basically areas that it wants to control. Not necessarily in peacetime, but if there were a crisis or in wartime. The South China Sea is particularly contentious. The Chinese have built some islands there and militarized them, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But the Chinese want to essentially make it very costly for American Navy ships or aircraft, military aircraft, from operating inside the first island chain in the event of a crisis, because they want to defend, of course, China's coastline and China's territory. And so they've developed what we call anti-access area denial capabilities. China has the largest inventory of ground-based missiles in the world. And those missiles they're variable in range. They have short, medium, long-range missiles, but they are so precise that they can target and destroy most of our hardened shelters that we have in our bases in Japan, and they extend all the way to Guam. And if you look at that second island chain on the map, you'll see where Guam is. It's on that second island chain. And China's capabilities now extend into the second island chain. So there's a global posture review underway right now under Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin that is addressing this issue of the threats that China poses and how we can posture our forces so that we can strengthen deterrence, prevent a war, but also fight if we have to. Let's go to the next slide, please. So what's at stake in the South China Sea? You can see a picture up there of one of the islands called Fiery Cross Reef. It used to be this very, very tiny like atoll in the South China Sea. And China came in late 2014, early 15, and decided that it actually, even though it claims all of the land features in the South China Sea, it only occupied 7 at the time, and none of them were very large. And some of the other countries like Vietnam and the Philippines had larger holdings. They had built some pretty short airstrips on some of their holdings, and China decided it was time to catch up and assert its own presence and its sovereignty claims in the South China Sea. And so that's what China did. It militarized 3 in particular that are really quite large. You can see on the map there, China's claim is seen in that it looks like a cow's tongue. It's called the 9-dash line, and that's that red line. But the other colors show you the claims of the EEZs, or the 200 nautical mile zones, where countries have exclusive rights to resources like energy and also fish. And you can see all the other claims. There's Philippines and Brunei and Malaysia and Vietnam and the Philippines. They all have claims, as well as Taiwan. So, and people say this is on the other side of the world. Why do we really care? Well, a lot of shipping goes through the area, so we do care about the safety of commercial shipping. I personally don't think China would put that in jeopardy, but there are some concerns that they might in a crisis. Freedom of navigation for military vessels. The United States has a global program to protect freedom of navigation, to ensure that military vessels can sail anywhere in the world under the Convention on the Law of the Sea. Every country has exclusive rights, as I said, to fish, oil, and gas, and China is trying to bully these smaller nations and prevent them from developing what is rightfully theirs. It's affecting the Philippines and its economy, as well as Vietnam. And so the United States stands for their right to develop those resources. We care about international law, we care about the rules-based order, and we certainly care about disputes being settled peacefully rather than through the use of force. Right now, China is not using military force, but it's using what we call gray zone tactics. And that means they're using things that are below the threshold that would trigger a use of force by the United States in response to what they're doing. So if they're using maritime militia, or if they're using Coast Guard vessels to intimidate other countries, then the United States obviously is not going to use military force in response. So that's a huge set of challenges. And I think the next slide goes into some of this a little bit. If you'll go to the next slide. I think I have, I have a picture on the left of China deploying its oil rig right inside Vietnam's exclusive economic zone in 2014. There's 2 slides at the right. The one on the bottom is China's maritime militia. These are fishing boats, but they're trained by the Chinese military. Some of them are equipped with the capability to use some limited force against other fishermen. And right as we speak, about 200 of these maritime militia fishing boats have encircled a very small feature that is a part of the Philippines. It's very, very close to the main islands in the Philippines, and it's certainly inside their exclusive economic zone. So the Chinese use them to harass other countries. And in that slide at the top, you can see that that's just a 6-week-long period in which all of those red dots represent Chinese Coast Guard vessels operating inside the waters of other countries, which is not legal according to the Convention on the Law of the Sea. And they were, again, harassing particularly Malaysia and the efforts to develop energy by Malaysian oil companies. So go to the next slide, please. And Taiwan is really very much in the news these days, and put my cards on the table. I've traveled a lot too, but the only country that I've lived in the world is Taiwan. I lived there for a year and a half after college, and Taiwan was really never part of the People's Republic of China, although it was part of China historically for a short period. And in 1949, Chiang Kai-shek and the Nationalist Party was defeated by the Chinese Communists, and they, of course, withdrew to Taiwan. And the United States had a mutual defense treaty with Taiwan beginning in 1954. The U.S. almost gave Taiwan back to China under President Truman, but then the Korean War hit, and after that started, the United States decided that we should protect Taiwan. We sent the 7th Fleet into the Taiwan Strait. We then later signed a mutual defense treaty with Taiwan. And that treaty lasted until January of 1980. That was actually the period that I was living in Taiwan. And so this is a leftover piece of unfinished business from China's point of view. It is a goal of China under every leader to reunify Taiwan with the motherland. And China's been putting a lot of pressure on Taiwan these days, stealing away some of its diplomatic allies. Taiwan, of course, as the Republic of China, had a lot of diplomatic allies. Today it only has 15 left. And China is also putting military pressure on Taiwan. So if you'll go to the next slide. This is an example of China's military aircraft had not deliberately crossed the center line of the Taiwan Strait for 20 years until March of 2019. And now it is doing so with impunity and fairly regularly. On a daily basis, the Chinese are flying their own aircraft, sometimes bombers and fighters, other times anti-submarine warcraft aircraft inside the air defense identification zone of Taiwan. So they're operating pretty closely, and it's intended to intimidate. It's part of China's strategy of psychological warfare. And you can see on the quote on that slide, Xi Jinping has given one major speech on Taiwan since he came to power, and that was in January of 2019. And he said, our country must be reunified. It will surely be reunified. And he said that reunification is critical to the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation in the new era. And remember, I told you earlier, rejuvenation is a goal of 2049. So some people think maybe Xi Jinping has set a deadline for reunification. It's a ways off, but nevertheless, it is concerning. And the Biden administration, as similarly under the Trump administration, is very, very concerned about the potential for Chinese miscalculation in the Taiwan Strait and the potential for China to use force. So it's a very big issue in the U.S.-China relationship. Next slide, please. So I'll go through this fairly quickly. China uses economic statecraft. It uses carrots, it uses sticks to try and get countries to adopt policies that are favorable to China and don't damage Chinese interests. So the Belt and Road is a big set of policies. China's promoting projects around the world to promote connectivity. And in many cases, these projects are needed, rail, ports, for example. But the question is, how are they being done? Can the country really afford the loan, or are they going to be saddled with a great deal of debt? And will those countries then be more reliant on China? And so I think China is trying to shape a series of connectivity projects so that China is at the center of all of them, and China will then be able to promote its political influence around the world. It's also trying to set standards in technology, and that is also a concern of the U.S. There's also worries about China getting access to ports and potentially getting military footholds. Next slide, please. China's using trade coercion against a number of countries, and this is this slide shows some of the examples, but I'm really only going to talk about one since we don't have a lot of time, and that is the case of Australia, where you may know Australia has called for China to allow investigation of the origins of COVID-19, and the World Health Organization is involved in this effort. But Australia has irritated China by passing laws against political interference and barring Chinese companies from its 5G network, and just calling for the investigation into the origins of COVID-19 really, I think, was the straw that broke the camel's back. And so China is now blocking over 12 of Australian products. It's wine, it's sugar and barley and timber and lobsters. It's a broad range of products. And this is, of course, aimed at punishing Australia, but even more importantly, signaling to other countries, do not damage Chinese interests, or you too will be the target of trade coercion. Next slide, please. So another problem in the U.S.-China relationship is that China supported sanctions at the UN on North Korea, but it's violating them. And this is just an example. It depicts how vessels North Korean vessels are being allowed to operate inside China's 12 nautical mile territorial sea in violation of U.S. sanctions. They go there to illegally transfer their own coal and to also import more oil than they are allowed to import by the United Nations. So this is a direct violation of sanctions. And this is something that the U.S. has tried to work on with China, but so far unsuccessfully. Next slide, please. So I want to wrap up because I know there isn't a lot of time left. So I think I will just mention for this slide that China is trying to promote a new definition of human rights based on economic development and the right of the state to define human rights rather than a sort of more universal definition of human rights. It's also trying to create its own set of norms for internet governance. And as many of you may know, China blocks hundreds and hundreds of websites because it does not believe in freedom of information. This is an example of inserting Chinese norms into the international order. This is something that I think the United States is quite concerned about. Next slide. I think it goes without saying that China is trying to sell surveillance technology around the world. There are upwards of 1 million people who are in Xinjiang who are in so-called re-education camps. And there's a great deal of authoritarian technology there, but also it's being exported around the world. Xi Jinping said at the 19th Party Congress that China's path provides an option for other countries. And increasingly, he has repeated this. He has basically said democracy has failed. China clearly has dealt with COVID-19 effectively, so China's model of governance is better, and other countries should learn from China. And I think that's also seen as very threatening to the United States and Western countries who believe that really the post-Cold War order is underpinned by liberal norms. And so I think there's worries that China's trying to undermine those. Next slide, please. So we're seeing a lot of disinformation come out of China. This is relatively new. We really didn't see this until a few years ago. And it's really primarily centered around COVID-19, where the Chinese are saying that the United States military, when it participated in the World Military Games in Wuhan in October of 2019, that it brought the virus with them. It also says that the virus started in a bio lab in Fort McNair, Maryland, and the U.S. may have, deliberately released a bioweapon. There's all sorts of things the Chinese are doing to deflect attention from the possibility that maybe it really did start in Wuhan China. So there's a lot of disinformation coming out. I'm quite concerned about the disinformation surrounding vaccines because the Chinese are now amplifying Russia's message that our vaccines are unreliable and they're killing people. So they clearly want the United States to be mired in the pandemic for as long as possible so that they can benefit. I think that's truly a negative direction that the Chinese are heading in, but that's what we are seeing recently. All right, I think maybe I'll just go to the last slide. Let's just skip that and we'll go to the last. Well, I should mention this. We should at least ask the question of whether cooperation is possible. And the United States and China, when they had the meeting in Anchorage, they did talk about possible cooperation on Iran, Afghanistan, North Korea, and climate change. And I think that Secretary John Kerry, who's heading up the Biden administration's efforts on climate change, is very keen to work with China. I've also added on this slide global health as a possible area where we could work together. There are a lot of problems that the world has that China should be part of the solutions. And so we should not only focus on the areas of competition, but we also should talk about the issues of cooperation. And then finally, the very last slide is just to say a few things about the Biden and Trump administration differences. And you can go on to that list, the next slide, and I'll just highlight a couple of things the Biden administration is doing differently. The Biden administration has returned to the World Health Organization and the UN Human Rights Council, so it's engaging in international institutions. We just had Tony Blinken and Secretary Austin in Japan and Korea, so we're strengthening our alliances. We are trying to rejuvenate America. I think that is also quite a priority for the Biden administration. There's an emphasis on values and democracy and foreign policy. There is an opening to cooperate with China. I think the Trump administration didn't do enough of cooperation with China. That's my view personally. And the U.S. has now talked about areas where we might confront China, but there will be other areas that will just compete, and then there will be areas we will cooperate. We'll see if that works, but I think it's a good approach. And there is a de-emphasis on what I call the sort of ideological approach of criticizing the Chinese Communist Party, encouraging the Chinese people to induce change in China, emboldening them to perhaps even overthrow the regime, although that was never said explicitly. That has disappeared from the Biden administration approach, this effort to distinguish between the Chinese people and the Chinese Communist Party. So I've talked probably for too long, so I will turn to the Q&A and the discussion, and I look forward to hearing your own thoughts. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Bonnie. We really appreciate your insights. And there's a lot of stuff to get through between the U.S. and China. I would like to start off with one question for myself that we're starting to ask our speakers. The Biden administration is talking heavily about foreign policy for the middle class and really getting everyone involved and interested in what's going on with U.S. foreign policy. So can you outline maybe the top 2 or 3 items in the U.S.-China relationship that can really get people excited and interested in this topic and why they should care about what's going on between these two global powers?
Well, I think everybody is affected everybody will be affected by the outcome of this competition between the United States and China. We have over $600 billion of trade with China a year. One of the reasons why we have low prices of many of the things we buy is because we import a great deal from China. But then there are areas where we could have a lot of negative impact if China dominates supply chains. We had difficulty getting PPE early on in the pandemic. It almost all produced by China. Many of the pharmaceuticals are produced in China. Rare earths are produced in China. Our iPhones, if you have one, are usually at least put together in China. We would pay higher prices if we do less trade with China, but we also might have difficulty getting access to some things. If they're not built in China, we need to find other places to build them. So I think the trade relationship is important, but technology also is. I would also mention that innovation, just in our own country, comes from my perspective, from not only just our educational system, but those who are our students. Some of the best and the brightest in our country have come from China. The studies show that the vast majority of Chinese people who study here advanced degrees, and particularly in STEM areas, stay here. They want to contribute to the United States, and they don't necessarily go back to China. So we need to encourage students, and our universities, frankly, will suffer greatly if we ban students from coming to study in the United States. So that would affect all of us. And really, all of the issues that I talked about, if we ended up going to war over Taiwan, it would be terribly tragic. So ensuring that we have the military capability, and that is going to mean maintaining a fairly high level of defense spending, I think, although it may come down to some extent. But we need to have the capability in order to convince the Chinese, so that every day Xi Jinping wakes up, he says, today is not the day I want to confront the United States militarily, because it's still a very strong military power.
Yeah, I think particularly around the trade issue, it's been estimated that New Hampshire has lost around $152 million to the tariffs and to higher prices, and about 8,100 jobs. So right there, it just shows, even in a small state like New Hampshire, how big of an impact that can have. So I want to turn to a question from one of our members, Ivor Friedman. Today's news, again, reminds me that the culture in China is so different from that of Western world. It is as if we are speaking different languages and cannot understand them, nor they us. How can we start to understand each other and come to a state of live and let live?
Oh, that's a very big question. We do need to have experts in both countries who understand not only the different languages, but also the different cultures and the different histories. And that is part of having well-educated diplomats, because that's the background that these people have. There's nothing more important than our foreign service officers. Diplomacy should be front and center. We should be investing in it. And I'm so glad that Tony Blinken is going to be rebuilding the State Department. So many people left, unfortunately, in the Trump administration. And the other thing that I would say is we must have dialogue with China to manage our differences. And we have to structure these dialogues so that they are more likely to achieve the outcomes that we want to achieve. The Chinese tend to prioritize process, and the United States tends to prioritize results. And we have to make sure that we don't just get caught up in hours and days of very high-level public celebrations with CEOs from companies and big banquets. That's not what dialogue should be about. It really must be results-oriented. And so I hope that we will shape more effective dialogue mechanisms going forward.
Wonderful. So we're going to try something a little new here tonight. We're going to bring Elliot Berry from New Hampshire Legal Assistance on for a question.
I have a question and a follow-up. The initial question is whether there is a historical basis for China's claims in the South China Sea beyond that of Chiang Kai-shek back when he was in charge of the Republic of China. And my follow-up question is, how likely is it that you see armed conflict, especially a naval conflict, over those claims?
So those are really excellent questions. I'll answer the second one first, that although I don't rule out the potential for a collision between ships and potentially even U.S. and Chinese Navy ships in the South China Sea, I think that the risk of escalation to a broader conflict is really quite low. We did have a collision between our aircraft in 2001, and it was a Chinese fighter jet with a U.S. Reconnaissance aircraft. The Chinese fighter pilot died. And the U.S. plane, because the pilot was just, outstanding, landed that aircraft safely on the island of Hainan, which is, of course, part of China. And over a period of weeks, we did negotiate the release of the crew. We got the aircraft back in pieces, but it was a short-term political crisis. If that happened today, frankly, the tensions would be even higher. We have had some close calls between our ships in the South China Sea. We have some agreements in place with the Chinese to prevent them. But the Chinese are not abiding by these agreements all the time. People say most of the time their operators are operating professionally, but it's not true all the time, and we need to improve this. But the answer to the first question is that it is the only way to really establish whose historic claims are the most valid is to take a court case to the International Court of Justice. And that's the ICJ. And the only way you can take a case to the ICJ is if all the parties agree. So you could have, perhaps if China agrees, Vietnam and China could fight it out at the International Court of Justice. Well, the Chinese won't agree. They're not going to ever take this to court. That's my view. So that's why we ended up in July 2016 with an arbitral tribunal formed under the convention, the law of the sea. It was a Philippines case against China, and China refused to participate. But in an arbitral tribunal, it's okay. One side can make the case. And the Philippines won 99% of the case. And so, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm very reluctant to answer the question, but I will recommend a fantastic book because my friend Bill Hayton, who's a BBC journalist, but also is just an outstanding work digging into all of the origins of the claims of all of the claimants in the South China Sea. And he debunks China's claims. He thinks they have a very weak basis for their claims. And he basically says that there were Westerners who came through the South China Sea and they landed on these islands first, and the Chinese then co-opted the names and transliterated them into Chinese and then said that they owned these reefs and these rocks. But in his view, and he's somebody whose research I respect, China's claims are not well founded.
Great. So question from Steve: does keeping North Korea a dangerous nuisance to the West serve Chinese interests? I know you spoke a little bit about how the Chinese are helping the North Koreans circumvent the sanctions. So any thoughts on that?
I think that the Chinese view North Korea as dangerous in the sense that they can't control it. So if North Korea engages in serious provocations, more nuclear tests, more ICBM tests, more submarine-launched weapons tests, that could provoke a U.S. attack on North Korea. And you might remember during the Trump administration, we went through this period called Fire and Fury, where the Trump administration was very seriously considering a strike on North Korea. And that would be quite dangerous for China. The Chinese might feel compelled to defend North Korea, and they do have a security treaty with North Korea. It could just cause the collapse of North Korea, which would create a lot of instability and challenges. So I actually think that the Chinese find North Korea more worrisome as a sort of unpredictable factor. And they're also worried that North Korea might cut a deal with the U.S. That almost happened under the Trump administration. For the first time, we had a president meet with a North Korean leader 3-4 times, I think. And if they had cut a deal, North Korea could have had better relations with the United States than it had with China. So if China can control North Korea, then it's a lever it could sort of use, but China knows that it really can't control North Korea. So at this particular moment, North Korea's borders are closed, and it's very dependent on China for economic and particularly humanitarian aid. But that probably won't be forever. So maybe at this particular juncture, North Korea is useful for China because the United States needs China's cooperation on North Korea. And if China thinks, oh, if the US needs our cooperation on this, maybe we can get the US to ease pressure on us on something else, or we can extract some concessions from the US on a different issue area. And I think they also think, if they think North Korea is useful in the near term, it's useful as a sort of something they can get a trade-off for.
Great. So moving over to Taiwan, I want to bring Chris Reardon, a political science professor at UNH, on for his question.
In the past, Bonnie Glaser has talked about Taiwan being in a gray zone presence, that the threat coming from mainland China to Taiwan was something in which the mainlanders would try and divide and conquer. And I'd just like to question the degree to which she thinks that the divisions in Taiwan are that easy to manipulate, especially because of the threat coming from the mainland.
Well, there are deep divisions in Taiwan. It's a very polarized politics in Taiwan, in some ways like ours. I think we're very polarized as well, but they don't come together when it comes to the threat to China. There is no unity on what policy they should they should pursue toward China. There's probably more fracturing now within the Nationalist Party, the KMT, a sense that maybe being part of China is not something that is popular. So they won't explicitly push that now because they won't get enough votes to return to power. But I do believe that China tries to drive a wedge between the different political parties in Taiwan. And they try to use a lot of disinformation in Taiwan to shape their own narratives in Taiwan, and to create groups of people who see that they will benefit from a better relationship with China. And so they will promote integration between mainland China and Taiwan. There's certainly a rethinking about whether there should be, whether ultimately Taiwan is part of China or should be part of China. And the public opinion polls really tell a very clear story that the people in Taiwan increasingly, although the majority support the status quo, they increasingly support independence, either in the near term or eventually. And the numbers that support reunification, either in the near term or eventually, are about 5-6% today. They're really very, very small. So more people want the status quo indefinitely or eventually want independence. And this is the main, I think, trend now. And it will be difficult, therefore, to China to achieve its goals. And I'd like to just make one more point, and that is that I think China's goal is to convince the people of Taiwan by using psychological warfare and these gray zone pressures to lose confidence in their government and in the ability of Taiwan to continue to exist as an autonomous entity, so that eventually they will just say, well, you know, we really have no choice. The US can't come to our rescue, and our economic future is really with mainland China and not on this tiny little island. And they'll just give up, and they will say to their leaders, let's just go negotiate with China and get the best deal we can. China wants to win without fighting.
Yeah, that certainly makes sense. And I I think it's really interesting how you mentioned 2049 as a important date for Xi Jinping, and that would also bring us over to Hong Kong and the transfer from the British colony and the 50-year plan to keep democracy alive there. And that is supposed to come to an end in 2049, but there seems to have been some interesting movement in that way. So how has the relationship between Hong Kong and China and Hong Kong being this major international financial hub played into this whole strategic competition?
Well, Hong Kong, of course, was returned to China in 1997. China did make a promise when the turnover took place in an agreement that it signed with the United Kingdom that it would preserve autonomy in Hong Kong through what became known as the One Country, Two Systems, which ironically was developed by Deng Xiaoping for Taiwan, but has never been implemented in Taiwan, only in Hong Kong. And because of the protests that took place in Hong Kong, the very violent means that some of the protesters used, the fact that the Hong Kong government was unable to control what was taking place on the streets of Hong Kong with over 1 million people protesting, fears that the pro-democracy legislators might be able to gain a majority in their legislature called the LegCo, that China just decided they could not tolerate it any longer. And they had the ability, through the passage of laws, which of course became known as the national national security legislation last year in the very end of June of 2020, that was then imposed on Hong Kong. And we have seen them very rapidly implement that legislation so that One Country, Two Systems is being undermined in all sorts of ways. And I know people who teach in Hong Kong who have told me that they've been advised not even to hand out a syllabus to their students because they might get in trouble if it becomes known what is on the syllabus that they're encouraging students to read. So everybody, I think, is quite nervous, and many people have been arrested, some under this new legislation. And the UK has imposed some sanctions. It has actually said it will provide a path to citizenship for people who were born before 97. The United States is considering legislation now in Congress. It's I think the Safe Harbor Act, if I'm not mistaken, that would allow some people from Hong Kong also to come to the United States and people who are here perhaps to stay. So this is seen as an example of what China might do in the future to Taiwan. But Taiwan can't be controlled through legislation. China's already passed an anti-secession law, 2005. It might pass a national reunification law. They've been talking about it. It didn't happen in the National People's Congress session that just ended, but it will probably happen in the future. But China's going to have to use a different tool set to try to control Taiwan. And I think ultimately it will be, again, through this coercion, these gray zone tactics. And eventually, if they believe that they have to, I think we cannot rule out that they would use force. So people who live in Taiwan look at Hong Kong and they say, we don't want to look like that. We don't want to have that be the future that we face. So I think they're all quite scared by what has happened in Hong Kong.
Now, so we're coming up to the end here. We've got a lot of great questions, so I'm going to combine a couple of them here. But basically, the idea being, is there any increased collaboration between China and Russia, and how is that affecting our relationship with both those countries? And tying into that, a lot of talk about election interference from both of those countries. So how is China working to be involved in our elections?
Both great questions. You know, my understanding is that Russia's interference in our elections, that there's some evidence that it was really quite direct. And I don't think there's any evidence that China interfered in quite the same way. China doesn't use targeted means that I know of to influence the outcome of elections. What China generally does is to try to support a positive narrative about China in the United States. And it has a lot of operations through one of the slides I skipped was the United Front Work Department, and some of the operations that they conduct here, including at local levels. We, of course, have laws that bar people who are not our citizens from contributing to political campaigns. That might be done through other people and covered up, but there are countries that don't even have such laws. And Australia ran into this problem several years ago, where the Chinese were giving large sums of money to somebody who was eventually in their legislature, and then started spouting support for China's policies in the South China Sea. And there was a very direct connection between the money and the statements. So we don't see that in the United States, but we see other things. We saw a case where one of the Chinese consulates drafted a statement that was given to the legislature, state legislature in, I believe it was Wisconsin, which was a thank you letter that they wanted I think the Wisconsin Senate or something to sign, thanking China for its PPE, all of that it had given. Nothing is for free. The Chinese wanted some payback. You have to say we're terrific, we do great things, otherwise we're not going to give it to you. And we continue to see this in European countries as well. So that's the kind of way that China interferes. Also, a remark that I would make about our elections is that I think that the Chinese had things they liked about Trump and things they didn't like. And then there were things they knew they would perhaps like a little bit more about Biden, but also things that they really wouldn't like. So at the end of the day, I'm not really convinced that they had a preference. They knew that regardless of who came to power in the United States, they were going to face serious difficulties, because the latest public opinion polls show 9 out of 10 Americans have negative views toward China. So this is throughout our country now. So no president is going to come to power who's going to be pursuing, I think, very soft policies toward China. And then the question about China-Russia relations, which I think is really an important question. Many people predicted years ago that China and Russia would never cooperate against the United States. And I've always been struck by how those two countries, even though they have differences, they compartmentalize their differences and then they work in areas where they have common interests. They clearly want to undermine U.S. influence around the world. They both really want to undermine the post-World War II, liberal international order. Although Russia may want to destroy it, China benefited enormously economically from the liberal order, so they don't really want to destroy it. They just want to influence it, shape it, so it's more favorable to them. But I think, the Chinese also, there are areas in which they're worried about Russia, and they won't. We will not see an alliance between them, because the Chinese want to have freedom to maneuver. And just, a small anecdote, Putin meets every year with a group of experts. It's called the Valdai Forum. And at the last Valdai Forum, may have been actually 2019, I'm not sure, but it was sometime about a year and a half ago. And he mentioned that there could be an alliance with China. And then the Chinese foreign ministry spokesman was asked whether that was possible. And the Chinese really distanced themselves from it, like, we're good friends with Russia, but yeah, we don't want an alliance. And I actually think it's quite telling. Russia has used force and invaded Crimea. I think the Chinese don't want to get dragged into a situation that is really so confrontational with the United States. They have enough of their own issues with the U.S. that they don't need Russia to be part of it. But they will cooperate with Russia on a range of things that are damaging to American interests. So I suspect we will see more. We shouldn't define the alliance as the only possible thing that the two countries could do that would be harmful to the United States, because there are already things that those two countries are doing that I think are disadvantageous to our interests.
Great. Well, I see we are at time. So thank you very much, Bonnie, for your insights and for your presentation here tonight. We really appreciate you joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay. Well, we have one final thing before we close. We are happy to announce our next event will be with Liz Scher of the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. It will be on April 7th at 6 p.m. Right here on our website and our social channels. As always, we really hope that you have the opportunity to hear from Liz about areas in which foreign policy can be a bipartisan effort. So thank you all for watching. We really appreciate your help and support in helping to get people to better understand global issues and the impact that they have here at home. Have a wonderful night.